All right, well, welcome everyone. It's nice to have everyone here tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about a bit about nutrition and about different diets and how to optimize our health and our longevity and quality of life. So tonight's Tuesdays to Your Health. We do this once a month, and I'm Dr. Brad Jacobs. It's a pleasure to be here tonight talking to you all. I look forward and encourage questions. So if you have questions, please do put them into the chat box, and I'm happy to answer those. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay and see me okay. And I'll do a mix of a PowerPoint slide presentation as well as talking. And I'm hopeful that a mix of that will allow us for some time to have questions. Sometimes I'll talk about things that are more relevant or less relevant to what you want to hear. So feel free to ask questions if I'm not addressing those issues that you want us to talk about. So let me pull out some slides and we can get ourselves started. So just give me 1 sec here on this other screen. All right, so hopefully this is working. Let me know if I'm hoping that you're going to see presentation mode here. So please let me know if you don't see the presentation mode. Put everything up here. Okay, great. So great. So I call this grains, fats, meat, and sugar. What's left on the plate? Because pretty much everyone has a different. Everyone has a comment about pretty much anything you can think of that you're going to put on for a meal, except for vegetables. I think for the most part, people can agree that most vegetables are okay. Although there's the argument about people that are on a FODMAP diet and people that are concerned about lectins. So even vegetables can be restricted. But for most of us, that's not the issue. For some of us, it is. Some of us need to be on a low FODMAP diet. And for some of us, we have issues with lectins. But for the vast majority of people, vegetables are safe. With that said, what are the pros and cons of grains and fats and meat? And there really are no pros to sugar. That's pretty clear. So let's walk through a little bit of it. I think just to put things in perspective, I love this slide because it really talks about how our healthcare system, which is really a medical disease-oriented system, is oriented. We put most of our dollars towards the end of life, unfortunately, chronic disease, and we've designed our medical system, much to the chagrin of medical doctors, has designed the system oriented towards diagnoses around disease, and so that doctors can be paid for treating disease. And so there's very little money that goes towards the left side of this, where we get optimal value. And as many of you know me as an integrated medicine doctor, and having sort of being one of the folks that have been leading this field as it's evolved, big focus on lifestyle and self-care. which really, thankfully, is free and democratized across society. It's something we can all empower. And that's the healthy, low risk side, right? We're going to move ourselves towards the green half of this curve. And sometimes it requires motivation, and that motivation can be, a loved one that has a major event in their life, or you yourself experience a major event, a heart attack, a stroke, or something, and that really motivates us. But we're going to be talking a lot about tonight, what we're talking about really across the whole spectrum here. But I just wanted to sort of give you a bit perspective on at the system level. When it comes to food, I think most of us recognize that we've evolved quite nicely from Neanderthals. Unfortunately, now we're sort of at this pendulum swing, where most of the American population is quite overweight, and we've all been supersized. So portion size is really the biggest issue. And there is no question, looking at the science, that really by changing how we act, how we behave, we can actually reverse our own age. We can actually, even though our chronological age may be 59, let's say, we can go from 63 biologically down to 52, even though our biological age might be 59. So that's good news. And the challenge is, though, is the motivation, and that a lot of times requires accountability with loved ones, or a personal trainer, or a nutritionist, or what have you. If it's to orient this a little bit, one of the big pieces around our quality of our nutrition that we're getting really relates to the health of our planet. As we become more and more oriented towards farming and monoculture environments, we're depleting our soil more and more. And so the nutrients from which we get the food, and sort of the environment that the food that we eat live in, it gets increasingly depleted. And so the nutrients of that food actually get depleted. And that's been looked at across multiple vegetables, and showing the nutrient density being decreased over the past century. So I encourage you, when choosing food, to really think about how choosing farms that are sustainably maintained and have a biodynamic environment that is organic, but also is biodynamic, so that the nutrients are being put back into the soil is being turned. So it's a very nutrient rich environment. And I encourage you to grow your own produce as well. It really makes a huge difference. And so somewhat related to that, it's just of note, is as our biodiversity across the planet has decreased, we've noticed an increase in inflammatory diseases and autoimmune conditions. And you can see here, the left side of this graph really speaks to a declining biodiversity that's been measured since 1970 by two different indices, this living plant index and this other one called the water bird population status index. And on the right-hand side, you can see increasing rates of autoimmune conditions like asthma, like allergic rhinitis, which are sort of inflammatory in nature. And looking onward, even, increases in inflammatory bowel disease amongst children, cancers, particularly around the GI tract, which relate to the quality of the food that we're eating, and increasing rates of constipation as well, that slows the speed with which the feces moves through the bowel tract and increases risk of colon cancer. Much of that related to fiber reduction, as well as type 1 diabetes, you can see in the bottom right hand corner. So to really just think about, how do we maintain and support farmers that are maintaining biodynamic farms and sustainable orientation towards raising produce and cattle, for that matter, and other animals. I love this precautionary principle: when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. And this obviously relates to climate change and just the sustainability of our planet. And so a lot of what we're speaking to right now, at least. We definitely are what we eat. And that's sort of, as we walk through this, what I love to say to people who get very confused by what should I eat, what should I not eat, the fewer ingredients on the food label, the better. And if you walk into the produce aisle of your market, or you go to farmer's market, there's no food labels on any of the produce, right? Vegetables and fruit. there is no food labels because it's one ingredient. And I encourage you to purchase as much of that as possible. If you're thinking about sort of how to orient, the U.S. Dietary Association, USDA, unfortunately, is heavily influenced by lobbies. The lobbyists are primarily from dairy, cattle industries, and so that actually food pyramid is quite warped. And actually, you can see here when compared with the Mediterranean diet is about a 12% difference in favoring the Mediterranean diet. So with this SAD, the SAD diet is the standard American diet, the SAD diet, and most people can't even eat according to the USDA's diet, let alone the Mediterranean diet. And you can see here that you have a 23% reduction in mortality when eating Mediterranean-oriented diet, which we'll talk about later tonight, what specifically that means, versus the standard American diet. This diet, this pyramid I showed you here, which came out of Walter Willett's lab and a Harvard nutritionist, really shows you at the base there that daily exercise and weight management, which is really, core to healthy living. And then you can see here, next level up are whole grain foods. And they're suggesting at most meals. I have a different view on this, but just to walk through this is evidence-based supported. So there is science behind everything here. And then to the right of that, you can see are these healthy fats, and we're going to talk about this as we go through the night here. Healthy fats, the plant oils like olive oil, for example, and other vegetable oils. And then the next one above that is vegetables in abundance, which we've already spoken to. And then fruits 2 to 3 times a day. I think that's a little bit too much sugar, fruits 2 to 3 times a day. And then you can see the next level up are nuts, legumes. And again, those are all healthy fats, good protein in there for those nuts, and legumes having fats, protein, and carbs. And then the next level up, you move now towards animal-based products, right? So now you're at fish and poultry and eggs, which are saying you can have as much as a couple times a day. And of note is those eggs. We used to say eggs are bad for you. They're not bad for you. The cholesterol in the egg, when you eat it, does not convert to cholesterol directly in your body, which is what was told in the past. It does at a small level, but a very small level. And then the next level up is calcium. And now actually the recommendations have changed since this pyramid has been originally produced. We really don't want people taking too much supplemental calcium. What we found is if people take in more than 800 milligrams of calcium in a day, they can increase the risk of heart disease. Now, we used to recommend calcium for bone health, and we still do, but you really only need more like 800, not 1200 or 1500 like we used to say. And so for those of you that are supplementing with calcium supplements that maybe they're taking 500 to 600 milligrams 2 or 3 times a day, we encourage you to stop doing that and only take it maybe once a day. And that assumes that you're not really eating much dairy. If you're eating dairy, the odds are you're actually across your diet, your odds are that including dairy, you're getting 800 milligrams a day of calcium. And then finally, at the very top are cow and white. So cow meaning red meat, and butter, they say use sparingly, and then the white products like rice, white bread, potatoes, and pasta. So this is a great pyramid. If people can eat towards this, they're doing really well. And from this point on, I'll give you some finessing. I personally would put the vegetables at the bottom rung and swap out the whole grain foods for that. I think people can have grain-based foods, and there's a lot of fiber in it. But I think a bit more sparingly. I personally would reduce the fruit count to 1 fruit a day, maybe 2, or low glycemic fruits at least, like berries, for example, and they should be eaten organically. And again, the calcium changes. And I think we can, and we'll talk more about red meat and other parts too. Okay. So let's speak a little bit about fasting, caloric restriction. There's a lot of people doing that right now. There's a lot of benefit to it. And there's a little bit of concern. So around timed eating, which people call intermittent fasting, I prefer to call it timed eating because there's some confusion around intermittent. There's so many different ways to fast. So intermittent fasting is a bit confusing because you could intermittently fast over the week, or you can intermittently fast over the day, or you can intermittently fast over the quarter. So timed eating really is intermittently fasting over the day, if you will, meaning you don't eat over 14 hours or 16 hours, some people do. A better way to view that is I'm just going to eat within an 8 to 10 hour window. And the reason people do that is that we find that when you do that, you concentrate your calories during that daytime. And then at night, you'll start accessing, if needed, fuel that it will be ketone based rather than glucose based. And that decreases insulin levels, which is what we want, lower insulin levels, so that we increase insulin sensitivity. So there's been a lot of research looking at this, and it looks quite favorable by bringing in the number of hours over the day that you eat, and then allowing the body then to metabolize the food fully, use the glucose up fully that's in our body, and probably access some of the glycogen storage, glucose, which is a source of glucose in the liver. And then if needed, when needed, like wake up in the morning and you exercise before eating, then you'll tap in, you'll sort of deplete the remaining glucose and then tap some of the fats, primarily your body fat, to access ketones as your fuel source. And that helps you burn body fat and then increase your insulin sensitivity, right? By burning body fat, because you reduce body fat, which improves insulin resistance or reduces insulin resistance. Resistance meaning you're making the insulin receptors more sensitive to the insulin in your body. So that's timed eating. And what we found is people do well. What we think is it's better off actually eating more toward doing the timed eating that, which most people don't do, towards the front half of the day, meaning that you start eating maybe around 8 in the morning and finish eating by, for example, 4 p.m. is better for most people than starting at noon and going to 8 p.m. And why we're not sure, but one study that Ethan Weiss produced at UCSF, who's a cardiologist, showed that it's only one study, but he did show that reduction in muscle mass, lean muscle mass in the legs and arms amongst those folks that were actually fasting through starting like through the morning, so they wouldn't start eating until noon. So it's only one study, so I think we need more research to really prove that out. But if you're doing time eating, you might play with that. It's a little bit harder because it means if you're done eating by 4 or 5 o'clock, then you're going to get hungry, or you need to get yourself to sleep relatively early. Episodic fasting is another approach, meaning you do it maybe once a month for a day or two, or maybe do it quarterly. There's a modified version of that some of you may have heard of called Prolon that Victor Longo produced, that I believe is at USC. And that is that you've given basically 500 calories a day. It's sort of a prepackaged program over the course of 5 days. It's prepackaged food, mostly like dehydrated soups and things like that. And then over 5 days, you do this fasting mimicking diet where you have just a little bit of calories through the day. And that has been shown physiologically to have amazing effects on a number of cardiac related markers, as well as other physiologic markers related to diabetes risk, like insulin sensitivity. And then there's really a lot of research that's looked at blue zones for people that are living past 100, right? In these areas that there's a higher proportion of people living with high quality of life in their 90s and 100s. And what they found, almost without exception, is most of those people are daily calorically restricted. So they're quite lean, and there's a slight sort of hormesis, if you will, a slight pressure on the system because they don't have as much calories in their body every day. And that's the caloric restriction model. So there's various ways to fast. You can do it sort of, on the regular, if you will, daily by doing it 14, 16 hour food restriction, meaning you're eating over 8 or 10 hour period in the day. You can do it episodically, sort of like, okay, I'm going to go fast for 3 days or 5 days every quarter. or some people like to do it once a month for a day or two. And these are all different ways to sort of reboot the system. And what we think is happening is under this mild stress is that the body does a reboot, and we actually purge out the mitochondria that isn't functioning as well, which is the powerhouse of the cell. And we reboot and sort of better tune the existing mitochondria, and maybe even create new mitochondria, what we call biogenesis, in our cells to allow the machinery to function better. And so there's sort of a retooling or retuning of the system at the intracellular level. And then at the macro level, we are also stressing the immune system a bit. We're stressing the neuroendocrine system. We're affecting insulin sensitivity. And also for those that are overweight, they're dropping body fat in particular. And all that improves blood pressure, cardiovascular risk, mental clarity. A lot of people that move into these fasting states get incredible mental clarity and a lot more energy sort of after they go a bit through the funk. So depending how sort of clean living you are going into your fast, if you're sort of eating sausages and pizzas and beer and wine, and then you go fast, as you detoxify from all that, you will feel, people can feel fluish and low energy, and then they sort of come through the other side and feel bright and clear and a lot of energy. If you come into it somewhat relatively clear in how you're eating, then you'll have less of that fluish experience as you transition through. So I just want to spend a bit of time on that. And now I'd like to sort of talk a little bit more just about food, like what is food made up of? Carbohydrates, protein, and alcohol and fat. Particularly in the Bay Area, I mentioned alcohol as its own category of food because it's quite popular in the Bay Area, and with COVID, it's become quite popular nationally and globally, for better and worse, as sort of our method of medicating or self-medicating. But you'll see here, there's different calories per gram of substance. And that's important. So you'll see that fat is actually calorically quite dense. And so some people that do their best to really eat in a healthy manner, and they don't understand, so they're eating lots of nuts, for example, and they don't understand why they're not losing weight. They need to keep in mind, it's good to eat nuts, but you just got to remember how much you're eating, because you're getting 9 calories for every gram when you're eating fat. So a macadamia nut, which you can grab a handful of and quickly eat 150 calories, or an avocado, which is probably 150 calories in a whole avocado, sometimes up to 300 calories, depending on the size of the avocado. You just have to be mindful of a bit of the calorie count versus the carbs at 4, and so does protein. And here's a great example: healthy diet, vegan, but there's a fair amount of carbs there, right? So you got rice, you've got carbs in, the beans have carbs in it as well. The carbs that are in broccoli and spinach are non-digestible. So you don't absorb those carbohydrates for the vast majority of it. So they're really not that thing to worry about. But I would sort of cut that rice content in half. And if I were having this meal, for example. Here's what we consider sort of the quote healthy diet. I think the rice amount is fine. I think the vegetable amount is too low. So if I were laying out this dish for you, I would say the whole plate should be greens, and then you're laying on top of it that looks like probably chicken breast, and then a side of a little bit of carbs on top of that. And the reason I say that is because every serving of food vegetables that you eat, and fruit in this particular study, reduces your risk of death, all-cause mortality. This is a summary slide that looks at a whole bunch of different ways of dying. And they also broke it out amongst those different ways of dying, which might have been respiratory infection, pneumonias, could have been heart attack, could have been stroke, could have been cancer, but summarized all into this. And you find that with every serving, no matter where you are on the scale, up to 7 servings, with every serving of fruit and vegetable, you're improving your quality of life, and you're reducing your risk of dying. Up to 42%. There is no medication on the planet. There's no surgical intervention on the planet that can reduce your risk of mortality 42%. So everyone looks for the silver bullet, and vegetables are a silver bullet. If you move from 1 serving a day to 2,
you're reducing your risk by 6 to 8%. And from 2 to 3 and from 3 to 4, you can see here, all the way up to about 5 vegetables. And then as you go from 5 servings to 6, you're still improving, but less so. Again, so that's why fill your plate with veggies. Here's an example of a nice way to eat vegetables. So, how long will it take you to eat this salad? Probably there's a lot of chewing going on there. So a way to sort of solve for that, you see here's Trader Joe's, a bag of organic spinach. You can see how much of the spinach I took out compared to that full bag, which looks like a lot of spinach to chew. But if you actually throw a little olive oil and garlic on there, or if you're a low FODMAP guy, then you're not using garlic. But anyway, if you cook this up, look how little it makes, right? It's 3 bites and you're done. So there's lots of ways to get your vegetables in. I do not recommend you boil your vegetables, but short of boiling vegetables, you can pretty much cook it any way you want. And if you overcook them, that you tend to sort of bleach out the nutrient density. But so al dente is really ideal. And I encourage you, these are all homegrown vegetables that we grew here in my house. Blueberries, some hot peppers, some kale, and some tomatoes. And I encourage you to do the same. They taste so good and so much better. So what should we be eating? There's a range of choices out there. If you go to the Santa Cruz Boardwalk, this is an option for you. Deep fried cheesecake and a crunchy sweet tortilla. Probably couldn't eat anything that is more bad for you than this. And I believe doing everything in moderation, including moderation, but this doesn't really even fit into that category. So, number one, you really try and eat a variety of colors in your food because each of these colors reflect a different phytonutrient. And so the more of these that you can get into your system, the better. So a bit of purple and red and orange and green, is really allows you to get that full spectrum of phytonutrients that's available to us. So let's just think about different diets and what are the options. There's a lot out there. I just put a few in here. The ketogenic diet, this guy named Finney sort of really was the original person that put this out there and studied it. There's a paleo diet, and Cordain was one of the original guys looking at this, researching this. Dean Ornish's work around the vegan diet, Mediterranean diet, which we'll speak more into, coming out of Europe, and then the SAD, the SAD diet, the standard American diet. So if you look at the carbohydrate intake here, you can see huge differences, right? Everywhere from a ketogenic diet where you're having very little carbohydrates and very high fat content of 70%, to the opposite, which is the Ornish diet, which is a high carbohydrate diet and an extremely low fat diet. Then you have the one sort of in between, which is the Paleolithic diet, where you get a lot of meat, and that's why you see the protein fat content both combined being quite high. But they really tend to push whole grains for the 30% carbohydrate diet. The Ornish diet is heavy in carbs because it's vegan, and so they really end up pushing a lot, and it's low fat, so you really end up with a lot more carbohydrates. They've since modified it a bit to actually have more olive oil and fish oil as a pill, not eating the fish itself. And then the Mediterranean diet, you can see also has a fair amount of carbs and a fair amount of fat, and then modest in the protein layer. What you'll notice amongst all these is the fiber content is quite high. To get the fiber content so high with a ketogenic diet, you actually tend to need to supplement. Even though you eat a lot of vegetables, people tend to need to supplement with more fiber just to get enough fiber in them, and a lot of hydration because it can be constipating. You'll see the standard American diet, which is really basically the saturated fat diet, that's what I like to call it, is depleted in fiber because it's processed foods, it's lots of carbohydrate, it's lots of white products, and really the least interesting. So let's talk through some of these a bit more. There's different ways to get your carbohydrates. While this all looks delicious, most of this is white-based. And every single one of these pictures here, you can see none of this existed 50 years ago, or maybe now 60 years ago. These are all modern civilization manufactured foods, and they go directly to the pleasure center of our brain. And which is why when you give this sort of foods to your child, which I witnessed with my children, it's like drugs, right? I mean, it's nothing, it's amazing to watch what happens to them. And the stats are greater than 70% of the energy is coming from these foods here on this slide. I mean, these were virtually unknown to ancestral human diets, which is just phenomenal. Like I said, it's highly addictive. They claim that sugar is 8 times more addictive than cocaine. It really just hits that dopamine pleasure center that in the nucleus accumbens, and there's just nothing like it. And you'll find people, they love it, and then they quickly need more. And the reason is, if that ever happens to you, is what happens is you get the pleasure center hit, and then you want more for that reason. And also physiologically, you get a bolus of glucose, because when you absorb, what happens is rather than you have a whole grain piece of bread, let's say, with all these nuts and sort of kernels in them, and it takes you, let's say, 30 minutes to digest that. So the same amount of sugar that's in that piece of bread, let's pretend is in a piece of Wonder Bread, white bread, or sourdough bread, okay? But the time that you absorb the sourdough bread is in 5 minutes versus 20 minutes. So the same amount of sugar gets absorbed. So the peak is much higher in your bloodstream of the amount of sugar that gets absorbed. So that means that the insulin response to the body has to be much stronger to grab all that sugar that's all there all at once from the sourdough bread and bring it into the cells, versus the grain bread that has less of fiber in it. It's slower, so less insulin is released over time. There's less of a robust insulin response. When you have that loud insulin response from the sourdough bread, it's like going to a concert, a loud concert over and over again. The receptors, our ears, let's say, at the concert, the receptors start to tune out all this insulin. And so they become insulin resistant. And so the receptor that catches the insulin on the cell, that because the insulin grabs the glucose, comes to the cell, knocks on the door, and says, can I let in the glucose? And then the door opens and the insulin brings the glucose into the cell. That receptor requires more and more insulin in order to open that door because it's become insulin resistant. So that's the journey and the process by which we get insulin resistance. So the quality of our carbohydrate intake, if we're having carbs, is really, really important. And you can see here, even a sweet potato or a yam, if you undercook it, it's much more fibrous and not nearly as tasty, admittedly, but much more fibrous. And so it's the same principle. It's like, if you want sourdough bread for your yam, or you want this fiber-rich bread for your yam, if you undercook your yam, you're getting the grain high fiber bread, versus overcooking it when it's sort of, on top is the brown beads and the sugar just really manifests out and caramelizes on the top. And you take a spoon in and it's like pudding inside, and it's delicious, but it's essentially all the fibers broken down. It's basically pre-digested for you. And that's what this graphically explains right here. So you can see the low glycemic index versus high glycemic index. And really, you can talk about the peak glucose levels over an amount of time. So as I mentioned here, the ripeness, which is really similar to how much you cook the food. You take a banana that's a little underripe versus a fully ripe banana, the sugar content's very different. And similarly around the density of the yam and other things we talked about is the amount you cook it. And then secondly is what I tell my kids: if you're going to have this stuff, eat it with other things. Eat it with protein, eat it with fat. If you're having the carbohydrate, by combining it with food, with protein or fat, you slow down that absorption. You slow down that absorption, that digestion and metabolism of the carbohydrate into glucose, and then you slow down the insulin response. So combine it. That can be really helpful. So what about animal and non-animal sources of protein? Nobody loves the ribeye more than I do. I love ribeyes, they're great, but I try and limit those, to once a month. Sometimes if people really love them, I say, okay, you can do it once a week. But the reason is you really want to avoid too much animal protein. And we'll talk a bit more about that. You'll see here in this large study that was done It's looking at red meat consumption and mortality. You can see this looked at 2 different cohort studies, and you can see as red meat consumption goes up is when you start to see a problem. So if you're not eating too much of it, on the left hand of this curve, of this graph here, like under 1 red meat serving per day, you can see you're a little bit above 1, but not too much. Then as you move up to having 3 servings a day, you can see you really move up to 50–60% increase in risk. So it's really about moderation. That really is the most really relevant piece. There's a question here I'll just respond to about yucca, yams, sweet potatoes. Do they belong to the potato category? And in essence, they do. Is there an ideal time to consume those? I don't really know about the timing. There's a lot of different thoughts around exercise and timing, and whether or not you can carb load before a big, particularly endurance program. And I've seen mixed reviews about that. Some people really talk about using fat. There's a lot of ketogenic and ultra endurance athletes. There's a lot of also now vegan ultra endurance athletes, but there's sort of mixed feelings about that. So that's unclear to me. With respect to in general timing of the day, I would say earlier in the day is better. You really want to avoid having lots of sweets towards the evening, and this would be considered, so depending on how you're cooking it, could be considered that. And it's important then, if you're getting enough fiber, to have that be part of it too. So some people like to have high fibrous foods in the morning to help them move their bowels, and some people do better towards the end of the day. So if you're looking at, again here, what would it be like if I were to replace a serving of meat with something else? And you can see here the reduction, the benefit, basically. This is what we call a hazards ratio. So it's a probability for dying, and less than 1 is good. It means I'm 80% as likely to die as this guy next to me. So in other words, there's a 20% reduction in my chance of dying. That person's chance of dying is 1, my chance of dying is 0.8. So that's a good thing. So you can see here nuts. And then, by the way, if you look at the arrows here, or sort of these bars that go across, you can see there's sort of a vertical bar, short vertical bar, and this long line, and a vertical bar on the other side. And that's showing you the confidence interval. So a lot of these overlap somewhat, meaning that regardless of what you substitute it for the most part, people do better. So whether it's fish, which actually looks pretty much the best. I mean, there is some overlap, although not a lot. And then poultry, whole grains, low-fat dairy, legumes, or nuts. Swapping those out for red meat looks like it's a good thing. So some people ask, well, is it the red meat that's the problem? Or is it that I just reduce the amount of red meat because I'm introducing healthier foods? And is that helping? And that is open for debate. I think that most of the data shows that there is issues with cancer in particular in red meat. But you'll see here that swapping out nuts, swapping out fish, poultry, all provide some benefit. I said that wrong, by the way, before. With the biggest benefit being nuts, because you see that's at 0.8 versus fish, which is more like at 0.92. They all are statistically significant because they're below 1. So pretty much substituting anything of it for red meat is a good thing. And then what about processed meat? Sausages and bologna and bacon, and this clearly shows that it's hazardous. You can see here that above 30 grams per day, you start going above 1. So at 100 and call it 120 grams per day, you increase your risk by 30% of dying. And so going up to 200 grams per day, you increase your risk by about 80%. So clearly processed food meats is a problem. 3.3% of all deaths could be avoided if people limited processed meat consumption to less than 20 grams, which is a day. So again, what does that mean? That means bacon, that means bolognas, salamis, and things like that. So again, you can have it, but in moderation is my view. What are our protein needs? They're really quite low. They're much lower than we think they are. we eat way more protein than we need to in the United States. And you can see the current recommendations here are around 0.5 gram per pound. So if you're an adult, let's say even an athlete here, competitive athlete, call it 0.8 grams of protein per pound. So if someone's 150 pounds, that roughly translates to in a 2,000 calorie diet. You can see 24% of their diet should be from protein, which is about 120 grams, which with 4 calories per gram means you're 480 calories of your diet, of the 2,000 calorie diet, which makes 24%. So depending on what your caloric needs are, that gives you a sense of what you need from, and you can see it's about a doubling from someone who's sedentary to someone who's active. And then non-animal meat protein sources. So if you were to have, 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, you get 7 to 8 grams, right? So what about dairy? Dairy, you get a lot. So if you had a cup of Greek yogurt, you can see here, Greek yogurt in particular has a lot of protein in it over all the yogurts. You can get 23 grams. So going back to here again, you're still trying to shoot for 120 grams if you're an athlete, sedentary 60 grams. So you can see here, it requires a fair amount of focusing to get enough protein for yourself when you're not eating animal protein. So again, hopefully for those that can handle dairy, dairy is a good way to get non-animal meat protein sources. So what about fat? Good fats, bad fats, and that's pretty clear. And really, I think about fish, I think about avocados, I think about vegetable oils, I think about nuts and nut butters as our ways of good fats. And then there's lots of ways to get bad fats. And thankfully, trans fats have been really removed from the marketplace. They are 100 times more likely to cause heart disease than eggs, so like that sort of cholesterol-based fat, and 10 times more likely to cause heart disease than saturated fat. And you can see here, change in mortality, for overall mortality, 20% increase in risk. And then you've got saturated fat at around 10% increase in risk. And then you've got the other sorts of fats. So these plant-based fats, which are monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. And you can see here, fish and nuts being great sources of polyunsaturated fats, and the monounsaturated fats, like avocado and other nuts, being a great source too. All are quite protective and quite helpful. So nuts, dairy, animal flesh, really a balanced food, and trying to get good sources for protein. I really think that's a really healthy way to approach that. And then where do we go from here? So I'm a big proponent of ketogenic and Mediterranean as a really healthy way. So ketogenic is a lot more challenging for most people. And Mediterranean is a really nice, healthy way to approach things. Not as much a fan of paleo, and we'll look at some of the research here. So, and just checking my time, got about 10 more minutes. So I may go through some of these slides and skip a few, make sure we have some time for questions. But this is a randomized controlled trial that was done, about almost a decade ago now. And they looked at the Mediterranean diet, and they looked at it with extra virgin olive oil, or done with nuts, extra nuts, or just a control diet, like advice on, hey, reduce your dietary fat, but not really giving them explicit instructions. And education. And this was sort of arguing around, a calorie is a calorie, right? And the answer is no. And that food quality is a huge contributor to our personal health. This study was actually stopped early because the results were so good that it was saving lives that they felt it was morally unjust to continue the study. This happens on big pharmaceutical drug trials when there's a cancer drug, chemotherapy they're giving someone, and it's so clear this chemotherapy is working to save lives that they stop the study short. Or same with medications for heart disease, or stroke. This is what they found for this. It was so clear that they were saving lives that they felt compelled to stop the study. So what did it look like? Here's the data. So you can see here, on the top graph, the primary endpoint being heart attacks, strokes, and death. And then the bottom one being just total death, total mortality. And they both look pretty similar. But what we found here, looking at the top one, is a control diet clearly didn't do very well. And the Mediterranean diet with nuts and the green one with olive oil clearly won out. And you can see the hazard ratio is 0.72 and 0.69. So roughly a 30% reduction in death, which is amazing. If you looked at total mortality on the lower graph, you'll see the one with nuts for some reason is better. It sort of goes up and down. And the other one was 0.9, the one with olive oil. And there's some reasons for that and some of the study design. And so many of folks, and this was more of a secondary outcome. The primary endpoint was the top one. And so therefore that's how the study was actually designed. So most people are very convinced by the outcomes of this primary endpoint study. And then, the best, how do you sort of make this operable for you? What is a Mediterranean diet? And really what it is using a lot of olive oil, a lot of vegetables, whole grains when using cereals, and nuts. There is fish and poultry, but not huge, portions of it. So it's really in the style of how the Southern Italian and Spanish and Greeks would be eating. And then there is dairy product, but there's a lower intake, and there's a lower intake of red meat and definitely processed meats and sweets. So really sort of healthy diet. Much of us eat this way in the Bay Area. And then let's just talk about carbohydrates and why ketogenic diets become such a big rage in the past, 5 years in particular. Here we looked at cognitive impairment. So this is looking at mild to moderate cognitive impairment. This was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. And what we see here, those that are eating more carbohydrates are at higher risk for cognitive impairment than those that aren't. That's the blue versus the green. And then we looked at fat consumption, same study, and they found the opposite. The more fat people ate, the better people did. So you can see here the green, highest quartile of carbohydrate, 89% increased risk of memory loss. Highest quartile of fat consumption, 36% reduction of memory loss. So high fat, healthy fat, that is, and low carbohydrate seems to be correlated quite nicely with memories. And then here looking at what happens to our body weight when we eat in a ketogenic fashion, huge reductions in body weight. This particular study was a non-randomized open label study. And subsequent studies are being published, but we do find that there's a big reduction in body fat in body weight amongst those that do a ketogenic diet. And what are some of the benefits? I spoke to this a little bit earlier. What we found, particularly when it comes to cognitive capacity, is as we get older, we don't metabolize glucose as efficiently for fuel, and we actually make quite good use of ketones for fuel in our brain. And so preferential use of ketones is actually at least intense mental clarity for a lot of people, and it's worth experimenting with and see how you feel. I've seen a lot of people go through this and really feel quite better. So a couple questions here, and I'm sorry if I misspoke, because there's a question why isn't fish better than instead of meat? I'm not sure which slide you're referring to. If it's something I said, fish is definitely better than meat. So I'm not sure if somewhere in here there was some that we alluded to meat being as good as fish, because it's not. And this slide sort of proves that right here: fat consumption and mortality. And you see fish at the bottom there showing a 20-some-odd% reduction in mortality. And you can see saturated fat of the meat sitting there, and that's an increase in mortality. So if we look then at how you might operationalize this, there's a couple different options to see if you're in a ketogenic state, meaning that you're producing ketones in your bloodstream. One is finger sticks, like you would do for checking glucose levels. You can do that for ketones. The other is peeing, which is less accurate, but easy to do. And there's a new method that a couple good companies out there now that they use your breath and you breathe into a device, and that can measure your ketones. There's the Keto Reset Diet. Mark Sisson has a whole primalblueprint.com, I think might be his website. He's got a whole packaging. If you're interested in this, I think he's a good resource. There's others out there as well. But some people use way too much meat in their keto diets, and they don't really know what they're talking about. So you really want to find people that know what they're talking about. You do not want to be eating a lot of animal protein, because that completely is not what ketogenic is. Ketogenic is high fat, 20% protein, 10% carbs, so 70% fat. And many of those people out there that are unfortunately quite well known and getting popularized are probably doing 40% protein. And you will metabolize protein into glucose, amino acids, in the setting of low carbohydrates. You will metabolize protein as it breaks down to amino acid into glucose. So you really want a low protein diet. Here's an example of a breakfast I made that's ketogenic oriented. So you've got some raspberries there that are homegrown. You got my Meyer lemon tree that homegrown. Avocado tree I don't have, unfortunately, store-bought, which does not necessarily need to be organic, by the way, your avocados, because they have a thick skin. And then you've got cooked spinach underneath, and you've got 3 eggs with some chili peppers on there as well. So another example of a little bit of a processed meat here, just like a smidgen of I think that's salami, which is sauteed with the oils and a little bit of butter. And then I put the eggs in. You can see some sauteed fennel with some bok choy and spinach. Here's a nice way to make a great smoothie. So you can see the Greek yogurt I spoke to earlier about, which is a great source of fat and protein. All the milks that are non-dairy milks that are out there, you'll find that most of them are just empty nutrients, except for pea-based non-dairy milks. So this is an example of Ripple. There's a dairy-free milk. It's got a lot of protein in it and a lot of healthy fat. And if you have almond milk or soy milk, oat milk, they're empty calories. So that's why I'm using the pea milk. Then for like flax or chia seeds, you put in some coconut oil, you can put in green vibrance, which has a range of different phytonutrients from different vegetables, as well as probiotic, cashew nuts, and again, the Zymogen's product that makes a great phytonutrient-based product as well. And then you can blend this all up with the kefir as well, maybe a little bit of water sometimes. Delicious. Those are all the nutrient facts on the backside. Here's an example of dinner where you lay down a bed of lettuce. You throw down a little bit of some you can see a few beans in there. You can see some nice salmon on top, a little bit of wild rice there, a little bit of garbanzo beans. You got some feta cheese and some nice dressing. Here's another example of a dinner with some chili, some peppers, some shiitake mushrooms, yellow peppers, sauteed, bok choy, olive oil, garlic, and some halibut. This is just, an example of high vegetables, great fats in the fish with protein right here. So here's an example of really a nice way, healthy way of eating that's ketogenic friendly. And much of this sort of we've talked about already. The evening fasting we've spoken to, timed eating, the intermittent fasting we talked about, the ketogenic method. These are really different ways to get yourself into ketosis. So there are a few questions. So let me sort of turn this off, and I can speak to some of the questions that some of you have placed here. So thoughts on HCG injections with 500 calorie diets for limited time of fasting? Yeah, I don't know of a lot of data looking at HCG injection in the setting of fasting. So if you have any, send it my way, please. I don't know of anything that would be of interest to address that question. It's a great question. And if you have something, please send it to me. I'd love to review it. Is there a preferred diet to target high cholesterol? I tried keto, was constipated, and lab work showed high cholesterol. Yeah, so I think it's important. People can get constipated. It's important to take supplementation to increase your fiber and make sure you're drinking enough water as well. Triphala is a great, fiber, provides good fiber. Different types of psyllium husk are great ways to get fiber. With respect to cholesterol, it's important to do the profile of your LDL. So cardio IQ is one type of cholesterol test. Well, they'll actually look at your LDL, and we can see the large, medium, and small particle sizes. And by looking at that, even if your LDL has gone up, what we may find is that the particle size has shifted, so that you have a lot less LDL small, which is a small dense LDL, which are tend to be oxidized, and those are the ones that are atherogenic. Those are the ones that cause heart disease and stroke, versus the large fluffier LDL. So that's number one. Number two is people eat too much red meat, and they eat too much meat in general. And so for a lot of folks, we just put them on a much more restricted animal-based protein. I've worked with several patients and several friends that had the same issue. Their LDL went from like 90 to 170. And then we modified the animal protein intake, and it went right back down to about 130, 120. Ideally, people are below 100. So then if people are concerned about the LDL and that's elevated, I recommend people get calcium scans. So they do a heart scan of their, using a calcium, it's a CT scan, CAT scan of their heart that just looks at the arteries. Doesn't do a full, it's not like a full cardiac catheterization using a chest CT. It's a very minimal radiation exposure. And if your calcium score is low, then that puts you at dramatically low risk of having heart disease in the first place. So really you can sort of down-regulate your concern around them, hopefully modestly elevated LDL. So a calcium score, heart scan. Insurance does not pay for it. Do not do it at a medical facility like UCSF or other ones, because they'll charge you $1,000 or $2,000. Stanford, you could do it at for $150. And Simon Med and RadNet both do it at a discounted rate. So just ask the price. It's usually $100 to $300 to do a heart scan. I recommend most people get those anyway. A few other questions. I heard you say Mediterranean and then keto, so I'm confused. I think I may have missed something. Yeah, so there's Mediterranean diet, which is, think of the Greeks and the Italians and the Spanish and how they eat in a healthy way, where there's lots of olive oil, and there's lots of vegetables, and there's modest amount of fish maybe on the plate, and there's nuts and not a lot of sweets, and that sort of diet, that's Mediterranean. Ketogenic is totally different. Ketogenic is high fat, low to modest protein, very little carbohydrate. The only carbohydrates you're getting is through vegetables. There is no bread. There is no pasta. If you're having bread, it's almond flour bread, for example. Okay, a few more questions. Roasted vegetables. Roasted vegetables are great. Again, I throw them in the oven, a little bit of olive oil, salt, season them up. It's great. And I would just, you just don't want to overcook them, right? You overcook them and there's like no fiber left. So you just want to make sure that you cook them the right amount. You just don't want to boil your vegetables. About fish, how much fish can you eat? Is there too much? Well, in general, no. I think everything in moderation is better. So if you're going to have your fish, mixing it up. I think, should you have salmon every day? Probably not. But you can have it a few times a week for sure. And ideally, it's not farm raised. Ideally, it's wild, but it's hard to get regularly wild. And I think it's safe. And, if you're concerned about mercury levels, they're really a lower source for mercury, although you can get mercury from it, and PCBs. But so again, if you do it a bit more wild versus farm is better. And you can always check mercury levels. And my threshold for mercury levels is not, there's a toxicology and there's an epidemiology way to think about mercury levels. Unfortunately, what's become into mainstream laboratory diagnostic normal values is the toxicology limits, not the epidemiologic limits. And there's a logarithmic difference between those two. And it looks like clinically, really, levels have to be very high, like 100-fold higher than the cutoffs on the lab values to really have any clinical significance. So a couple more questions. What are your thoughts about low core body temperature and metabolism? Yeah, I don't know a lot about core body temperature and metabolism really making that big of a difference, unless obviously you're like hypothermic. But, if you're talking about a half a degree or something, I don't really understand how that would make a difference. But in general, exercise is great if you're trying to increase your metabolic rate. exercise is great. In any settings of hormesis. So for example, if you were going from hot to cold, I'm a big fan of folks, infrared saunas or hot plunges, and then moving to a cold plunge or cold shower, really quite invigorating. And that will actually cause a lot of vasodilation and contraction, really great for the muscular tone, really great for your immune system, very mentally clearing. And I think there is some early evidence looking at metabolism rates as well, being modified by that. Do you want to address alcohol? I don't know what you mean by that question. What is the best diet for osteoporosis? Best diet for osteoporosis. So again, it's really about thinking about getting enough silica, boron, vitamin K2, calcium, and D, not too much calcium, as I mentioned earlier. So really, I hope a healthy diet that we talked about already is quite helpful. I'm a fan of supplementing for getting some of those other nutrients in, and there are companies out there. I tend to use a lot of Zymogen products, but there's a lot of other products out there. Pharmaca is a great source to sort of go and look at high quality products and to think about supplementation. But a really high quality diet. Dairy is a good source for calcium, and natto is a good source. Which not everyone can really eat, with fermented tofu, fermented soy. And that about covers it. Sorry, I can't share my slides, but I will put I will put this talk up on YouTube like I always do on our YouTube channel, which is Dr. Brad Jacobs, DRBRADJCOBS. So you can feel free to watch it again or share it with others if you'd like. I really appreciate everyone's questions. It really helps keep me on my toes. And I don't always know the answers. So it's nice to get some thoughtful questions sent my way, which I really appreciate. So thanks for your time. We'll do this again next month, and look forward to hearing more questions from you and talking more in the future. Okay, take good care.